And so we're going to look deeply into the brain now. Let's describe the actual neurological process of lust. You may have heard of the process of stress. It's called the stress cascade. We're going to call this the lust cascade, okay? The first thing about the brain that happens with a sexual desire takes place in the hypothalamus. This area is a hardwired area of the brain. That's the drive centers of the brain. So the desire for food, for water, for sexual desires, all are rooted right there in the hypothalamus. By the way, isn't it interesting that Jesus said that at the time before the flood, men were marrying, eating, drinking, and marrying and giving in marriage. Eating, drinking, and sexual things, which is part of the marriage, right? And these were intemperate marriages. These were the daughters of God, the sons of God were looking at the daughters of men. Ooh, we like them. And so they were marrying based upon their personal preferences and their desires rather than what is wise and proper. So sex, food, and drink. That's what was going on before the flood. And then Jesus says in Matthew 24, as in the days of Noah, so also will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Men were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. Why does he mention those three together? Well, we now know scientifically. The hypothalamus is that internal drive center that says, that's good, that's good, that's good. And by the way, these are survival things, and sexuality is a part of procreation, a part of God's design for intimacy. So these things aren't bad in themselves. But if they are controlling desires, if they are like they were at the time of the flood, intemperate, then we have a problem. But here's the thing. The desire itself is not bad, sinful, wrong. It's hardwired in the hypothalamus, okay? So don't go, oh, why am I attracted to members of the opposite sex? Or why do I look at food and want to eat it when it's not mealtime? It's the initial desire is not sin. It's what we do with that we're going to look at the whole lust cascade process. But just remember, the hypothalamus, God has given this to us for a reason. He wants us to enjoy good food. He wants us to practice sexuality in its proper context and enjoy the wife of our youth. But here's where we go from there. Once the eyes lock on to an image, the first place that image stops is called the LGN. So when you see that billboard, you see that image, that magazine, that screen, the image on the computer, within the thalamus is the LGN. This is also hardwired and not very plastic. By the way, by plastic we mean changeable. We mean the neurons can be rerouted and you can gain some self-control. Not so with this very, very first area. This is a part of the experience within the brain that says, that's good. It's kind of like when you see that tasty dessert, right? The initial, you notice it. Of course you're going to notice it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. The brain says that's good, but then you get to decide what happens next. And that's in the visual cortex, the occipital lobe. So step 2, after it stops along the LGN as a stopping point, this is where we process the image visually. Actually, right in the back of the brain here is the occipital lobe, and the eyes take that image in, or you imagine it. If you're imagining it, it's the same thing. You're visualizing or you're seeing. There's occipital lobe activity. This is a place where we can have some control, isn't it? Because you can choose. That millisecond moment where the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the LGN go, that's good. You can choose to say, oh yeah, it is good, and I want to continue to behold things that are not healthy and reasonable and right and beneficial and God glorifying. Or you can bounce those eyes right at this point. We'll get more onto that in just a second. But once you're engaged now, once you've got the occipital lobe going off and you're enjoying and delighting and beholding this image, the lust cascade is in gear. It's kind of like the gas pedal has been pressed on your car and you're heading right down a highway and there are high containment walls on each side of that highway. That's the neural pathway in your brain that is going on. And there are a few off-ramps from this highway, by the way, but you've gotten on and you're hitting the gas pedal. Now the brakes, let's use the analogy, okay? The brakes are the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where you can make the decision to say no to something. The prefrontal cortex is where you can control impulses. Now here's the amazing thing, back to the slide. The physiological process that is engaged, if you're going down the lust cascade, the heartbeat increases to 100 beats per minute. At that point, your prefrontal cortex shuts down. Cortisol and norepinephrine have been released and you are in survival reactive mode. So that's why I say it's like a highway with very few off-ramps, because you are just, boom, zoned in, and the primitive centers of the brain, these more deep emotional desirous centers are just engaged and on fire, and the occipital lobe is taking it all in. 100 beats per minute is the point where the prefrontal cortex starts to shut down. So the heart rate goes up, and then something else is happening. When you are viewing this material or viewing an image, even just for a couple of seconds, it releases testosterone into the bloodstream, which is priming the body for sexual action. Now, the real unfortunate thing about this is once you've taken that few seconds to entertain that thought or view that image, the testosterone release has happened, and it takes a while for this wave of testosterone to subside. So if we're inviting these things, we're just getting this wave after wave, a tsunami of testosterone. It's going to be more likely leading to sexual misbehavior because we've invited this upon us. Step 4, as you've beheld that image or thought for more than that millisecond, the drive tension of the hypothalamus increases, and this causes an extremely important step. What's called the amygdala is agitated. Amygdala agitation. Now, the amygdala is also the center of fear and anxiety, and also this sexual tension. So when the amygdala is on fire, it's clamoring for and demanding a response. It's saying, must do something, must do something. So the amygdala is just inflamed. It's just going. It's going and going and going because you've beheld, you've invited, the testosterone's going off, prefrontal cortex is off, 100 beats per minute, and the amygdala is saying, let's do something with this. Well, step 5. Usually men relieve the amygdala agitation through masturbation. This releases enormous quantities of dopamine and endogenous opiates. The pleasure-reward center of the nucleus accumbens and the cingulate cortex are stimulated, just the same as with substance abuse, and then upon ejaculation, the amygdala immediately are calmed, anxiety and tension is released. So the amygdala clamored for it, and they got it. And this is the lust cascade that men are struggling with in such great degree. Now, what is the result of this? The next step is that norepinephrine burns that initial arouser into the memory to call it up at a later time. So the brain says, ooh, that was a very meaningful experience that I just had. This was very pleasurable, and the area of the brain is called the salience network. It's where it defines what is good and helpful and something worth remembering, something significant. That's what salience means. And so it defines what's important and good. We want more of that. So that initial arouser, the associations, the triggers are burned into the brain, and the brain, when it sees those again, says, ooh, this again, let's do that. This was a physiologically and emotionally significant event. Well, how do you stop the lust cascade from happening? That's the big question, right? Well, it's as simple as this. Don't look for more than that millisecond. Don't look a second time. Bounce those eyes immediately off of that. But many porn users have tried, many lust addicts have tried. I am going to not look. I'm going to grip my teeth and try really hard. And trying really hard has just failed epically, right? And there's a reason for that. I want to do a little experiment with you right now. Try not to think about a donkey with a pink ribbon in her hair. Now that's a silly example because now everybody has the image of a donkey with a pink ribbon in their hair. So if you say, I'm going to try not to think about something, you're thinking about that something, right? Jesus said that if a demon is cast out of a man and the house is not filled, if it's just swept clean and put in order, the demon will get 7 more demons more wicked than himself and go and occupy that house. So the message is, be sure to fill the mind with other things. Be sure to bounce those eyes and reflect upon something high and holy, to do other things physically, to try not to think about it. In fact, if you're trying to overcome a habit of any kind, an addiction, don't view it so much as, I am going to stop doing this. If you view it as ceasing doing something, then the something is what you're still thinking about, right? Say, this is what I'm going to do instead. We need to be rerouting these neural pathways into other things. And if we don't do that, if we just try not to, it's going to fail. Immediately fill the mind with something else. Now, also you need to be able to calm down. And one way that you can calm down is correct breathing. So that image pops up, you bounce the eyes, fill the mind with other things. By the way, there's 3 hours of solutions, so I'm giving you just like brief tidbits here, but there is a whole lot more to be said about other things you can fill the mind with, some strategies and techniques. But one of those techniques is take a deep breath, a very good deep breath. Proper breathing is something we don't do in our high-paced, high-stress society. We don't have proper respiration. And that's problematic because it makes it so that the brain does not function properly. When the brain doesn't have proper oxygen, the prefrontal cortex isn't going to be as good at, hit those brakes, let's make a good decision here, let's exercise self-control. So that oxygen really feeds into the prefrontal cortex. But also the oxygen does something else. A good respiration soothes the nerves, we read in Ministry of Healing, page 272. Soothes the nerves. This is so fascinating. This is scientifically accurate from over 100 years ago. There's a little nerve in the back of your neck called the dorsal vagal nerve. And when you take a deep breath, that nerve is calmed, or in Ministry of Healing's words, soothed. So what we heard from the distant past now we see is scientifically accurate. Take that deep breath. And practicing proper breathing is not necessarily something you need to do in order to get into, this is not Eastern meditation that we're talking about. You can have the mind filled with things, not emptying the mind, but you're still breathing properly. And we forget to do that. So sometimes my wife and I, when we're working at home, we'll set our phone every hour to have that phone go off and remind us, hey, have you gone an hour? Have you gone a significant amount of time with just stress or worries or forgetting Jesus? Spend some time in prayer. Make sure you don't go an hour without any thoughts of God. And so if you have those times of prayer, use those times also to make sure that you are breathing properly and getting that good oxygen in, okay? And this is not New Age meditation, but this is something very physiological and spiritual as we contemplate God and think about Him. So addiction is about the structural change in the brain that has taken place. And if that's the case, the key to freedom then will be to have new structural change, new pathways to replace the old. Now that's just a little window into a bunch more that I have on solutions on A Greater Lust. But let me give you a quotation from Dr. Struthers in his book, Wired for Intimacy. He says, if this corrupted pathway can be avoided, a new pathway can be formed. We can establish a healthy sexual pattern where the flow is redirected toward holiness rather than corrupted intimacy. By intentionally redirecting the neurochemical flow, the path toward right thinking becomes the preferred path and is established as the mental habit. By deepening the holiness pathways, we are freed from deciding what to do is right and good as they become part of our embodied nature. So literally, the old brain is being replaced by a new one, a whole new series of thoughts and connections, a new brain map, if you will. And the beauty of this, by the way, I can testify to this in my own life. Scott Ritsema is not a recovering pornography addict, but as a male in our society, growing up with the imprint of what sexuality is all about that is so warped, so distorted that you get from the culture around you and your peers, you have a struggle, right? And I can say that today, when I'm driving down the highway or in the airport, and this is, of course, only God's grace, that I can say the statement from Spirit of Prophecy that says, if you are allowing God to work in your life, your weakest points of character can become your strongest. The holiness pathway is just like firm in this area, not because I have done anything, but I can say guys who are going, no way, this is just impossible. This talk about being sexually pure is never going to happen. It can, and it does. Where you bounce those eyes and you have a distaste, that you get a little bit angry with the enemy for assaulting you in this way. And that's part of the strategy too. You say, no, thank you, and fill that mind with something else. And you will have part of your embodied nature, the holiness pathways, becoming stronger and stronger. And here's the promise. If the brain is powerful enough to get you addicted to a behavior, then it's just as powerful to get you, quote, addicted to a new behavior.